Welcome to another episode of the JPS Education Podcast. Today I have Dr. Gregory Haff, and we'll be speaking about periodization. So, Greg, thanks for joining.
Thank you. It's always fun to talk about periodization. It's a topic that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working in and researching and writing about.
Yeah,
So
of course. So, yeah, you've written a book titled Scientific Foundations and Practical Applications of Periodization. So, guys, check that out if you want to know more. And yeah, whilst we're on the topic of the book, I mean, how long did it take you to write that?
that was a pretty big endeavor. It took many years, mainly because work gets in the way of
Of
writing.
course,
So
yeah.
it took about 5 years to kind of
Well,
from conception to finish. Really,
yeah.
really lucky. I have a very good relationship with human kinetics and my
Okay.
acquisition editor, Roger Earl, who's been with me now for over 20 years. So
Wow.
um,
Yeah,
it was a really fun project. It was a big project and it
of
it
course.
was longer than they wanted.
Yeah, right. How many? 600 pages. I just saw now.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pages. So, Greg, periodization has a rich history in exercise science, which is maybe underappreciated and many people don't really know about. So, speak to us a little bit about the history of periodization.
So I think periodization, one of the things that is kind of frustrating at the moment is this
Hmm.
kind of backlash about periodization being only from the Soviets in the 1950s and
Right,
Matveev.
right.
And the reality is we can find the early um incarnations of periodization in ancient antiquity in
Hmm.
the development of military people with the tetrad.
Okay. Yeah, right.
So the tetrad was quite popular in the development of the ancient warriors and in multiple cultures. So we talk about periodization in ancient Chinese culture, Roman, Greeks, but it was from a military development perspective. So they would train for combat, basically. So I often tell people tactical periodization existed before, tactical meaning for
Right.
military
Uh,
existed before sport-based periodization. It wasn't
okay.
until the advent of the ancient Olympiad that they started to apply those principles to the preparation of the Olympic athletes. So I think we have a rich history of practical experience of coaches and military thinkers about how to apply training principles to kind of optimize performance. It wasn't until probably the 1900s that we started to see a lot more scientific inquiry. We started to see a lot more investigation. But to be honest, there's a lot of principles that we hold near and dear now that we're like, um, this is modern, this is the big modern trend. And the reality is I can show you books from the 1916s that actually show
Wow.
similar concepts. And so everything is just kind of not new. It's kind of a rehash.
Hmm.
So for me, from a sports perspective, we have the work of Fikala from Finland in the early 1900s that is phenomenal. His work was revolutionary and really forward thinking about breaking training in an annual plan based on the
Hmm.
seasonal changes and availability of training. And um, you've got Kotov from Russia who was talking about autoregulation in training and all these
Mm.
concepts that we think about today. It wasn't until Matveev who really did one of the largest research studies ever on the concept, published his dissertation slash book, where he looked at hundreds of thousands of Russian athletes to try to figure out how the best performers actually achieved. It was really a retrospective study. It wasn't
Right.
perspective. And I think that's where a lot of modern sports scientists really kind of they get real critical. They want to do prospective studies. And I
Mm.
don't think that's probably the best approach because you have the ability to mess up an athletic career in that perspective. So what Matviev did was revolutionary, and he found trends and he found certain um, directions that we could push training to optimize performance. And that was going on in the Soviet Union as a whole, because you had Laszlo Nadore from Hungary looking at the topic. And I actually think Laszlo Nadore is very much undercredited with the development of periodization. Most people don't talk about him. His work is phenomenal. I was lucky enough to study with Professor Mike Stone, who actually was friends with Laszlo Nadori, and they talked
Cool.
extensively about training. And so I was able to learn a lot from Professor Stone about things that Laszlo was doing. And his work is quite phenomenal. And it's very similar to what Matveev was doing, but he was doing it in Hungary. And then you have, you obviously have, Bondarchuk, Verkhoshansky, and Issarin, and all of those individuals. And then you also have some, Western researcher coaches that were experimenting with things. And then it wasn't until the 1970s when Stone, Garhammer, and O'Brien did some really nice work on, their theoretical model of training
Hmm.
in American football athletes and American athletes. And I think that rich history, it's been around a long time, but the debates we're having today are no different than the debates that Matveev and Verkhoshansky and Bondarchuk had in the 1960s. They all saw things very differently. Matveev was more global. He was more annual training plan, more long-term development across the year. Verkhoshansky was more at the programming level. In fact, he wrote a paper called Periodization is Dead.
Hmm.
And when you tease it out, they're all saying the same thing.
Hmm.
They're just
Hmm.
coming at it from a different
Hmm.
perspective that you have to have some sort of structure to the training process. You can't just make it up as you go along. They just put value on different aspects of the training process.
Yeah. So periodization can clearly look a few different ways. What are those similarities? Like, what are those key components that, hold true, that stand their ground across all these different styles? Or at least which ones do you value the
So,
most?
the best way for me to discuss periodization is to think of it as a construct of macro management of the training process. So I really, really, if you want to get me fired up, tell me that periodization is dead and no one uses it in a modern sport, and I'll basically prove to you in about 10 seconds that you're wrong. Because if you have a season and you have a targeted direction that you're trying to go, you've got some form of periodization.
Okay.
So for me, it's the macro management of the training process. And that involves forecasting, that involves knowing when you need to perform. That
Hmm.
means knowing when you have opportunities for training, knowing when you have opportunities for recovery.
Hmm.
And it's that global overbridging kind of construct. Now, where I think people get a little bit fixated, I blame us Western sports scientists for this. We tend to get stuck in systems and terminology, and
Okay.
I think we've really created a very false narrative, and I'll discuss that in a minute. It's not just resistance training, and I think there's this false idea that periodization is only resistance training. It's not. It's a holistic approach to the whole training process. In fact, there's some wonderful work that has just come out this month on periodization of nutrition, where they actually show how to align nutrition with the training process. And to me, that's all part of periodization, like because the fueling of the athlete is equally as important
Hmm.
as the training of the athlete. So I look at periodization as this management of all those elements, the
Yeah.
psychological, the motor learning, the tactical, the technical, the physical development, which would be our strength training and conditioning and speed development, and then also psychological.
Yeah.
When do we put our psychological training in? When do we put our resiliency training in? All of that to me is part of the periodization process. Underneath that, I can fundamentally use a multitude of programming strategies.
Hmm.
I can use flexible strategies, I can use rigid strategies, I can use different loading patterns, I can have different philosophical slants about
Hmm.
exercise.
Hmm.
I come from a weightlifting centric kind of mentality with strength training. Other people do not. But it
Hmm.
all fits underneath that paradigm.
Hmm.
Now, for me, and one of the things that people either like about my book or dislike about my book, I don't know, is that I don't consider the terminology linear periodization acceptable.
Right.
There really is no linearity in training. And even Matveev noted that in his book. Back in
Hmm.
the 1950s, Verkhoshansky said it, Bondarchuk said it, Hare from Germany has said it, Nadore from Hungary. You cannot progress training in a linear manner.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so this idea that linear periodization is a
Okay.
thing is not a thing.
Yeah.
It's a
Okay.
misnomer. And a lot of people attribute it to Professor Mike Stone. And in reality, he wrote a letter to the editor in 1995 where he basically ripped Dr. Dan Baker apart for accusing him of being linear in his periodization. And so a lot of this nonlinear, linear terminology, Isserin says it in one of his review papers, is just false narrative.
Mhm.
because periodization, one of the main goals is the removal of linearity.
Mhm. Got
We
it.
don't want to have
Yeah,
linear
that's
training.
right. Yeah.
So I think, modern, oh gosh, there's so many terms now for periodization. You got
Hmm.
reverse linear,
Hmm.
non-linear, flexible non-linear, um, you know, I just all these terms.
Undulating. Yeah.
Yeah, undulating,
Yeah. Yeah.
conjugate,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they're all a lot of times talking about programming strategies. They're not
Uh-huh.
talking about
Got it.
periodization.
Yeah.
So for me, I classify periodization in three ways. I talk about parallel models of periodization, which is where everything is developed simultaneously. So everything is given, the same amount of emphasis. And if we want to kind of classify it in a way that's really simple, in the early stages of long-term athlete development, we train everything
Hmm.
because we need multilateral development. And when we're younger and we're developing, we have a lot of recovery ability. We have a lot of capacity to do multiple things, and interference effects are really almost non-existent if you look at John Hawley's work.
Hmm.
As we become more trained, the problem is the only way to get better is to add more stimulus, which means more volume, more time, more
Hmm.
in each component. And eventually you get to a point where you are not able to recover from all the training. So you have to kind of break it into smaller chunks.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we
Hmm.
move more towards what I would call sequential periodization, where we
Okay.
actually go in blocks. Like I'm going to focus on minimal targets or a target and do it in a sequential way. Zimpero and Minetti showed very clearly
Hmm.
that if we want to maximize speed and power, alter the cross-sectional area in the muscle tissue, train it to be forceful,
Hmm.
and then train it to contract
Yeah.
quickly, move faster. And so that's a sequential development process. And we could look at a very similar process for aerobic training or speed or whatever.
Hmm.
And so those are the two ends of the spectrum, parallel, sequential. The more trained you get, the more sequential you have to become. And John Hawley shows that
Got it.
that the higher trained individuals display more interference effect
Hmm.
when you have
Hmm.
multilateral training.
Hmm.
So I think that's the first way we have to kind of look at it. Well, smack dab in the middle is what I call emphasis periodization, where we train everything but different concentrations.
Hmm.
And for me, with the work that I've done in the tactical space and specifically in the military, we don't train in the military for a competition because we never know when that competition is.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we have to train everything all the time, but we have to vary it because we can't recover from everything all the time.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I remember when I was in Spain, I was talking with John Hawley about his, interference model. He had written a paper with coffee, and I was like, you've just described the periodization continuum. And he was sitting there, we were having breakfast, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, you're correct." And so I really and I made a figure in my book of this where I show Hawley's data
Hmm.
progression, and underneath it is the models of periodization. So for me, I think that's probably one of the things that a lot of people confuse about periodization is that
Hmm.
there are these different loading models and there are these different structures. And a lot of the research that questions periodization is done in
Hmm.
untrained people where doing just about anything is going to make them
Hmm.
improve.
Hmm.
And very little is done at the elite end. However, there is a ton of work in the endurance space in cross-country skiers and cyclists and runners
Hmm.
that actually show sequential models work really, really well.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I like your thoughts on linear periodization not really being a thing because, like you said, with periodization, we don't really want things to be linear. We're actually trying to move away from that. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. In the hypertrophy space, there's a few studies that people always kind of reach out to, and the usual conclusion is periodization doesn't matter for hypertrophy, it does for
Yeah.
strength. It might matter here, it might not matter there. If you think about it holistically, though, like the way you outlined, is it fair to say that it just doesn't matter? Like if you take a more holistic point of view where you are considering nutrition and all these other components as well.
I think if you look at the papers where people question that,
Mm.
to quote Professor Stone, garbage in
Hmm.
equals garbage out.
Hmm. Hmm.
If you
Hmm.
look at their reference list, they throw
Hmm.
everything in the kitchen sink in there. It's
Hmm.
not athletes. You could have older adults, you could have
That's right.
children, you could have
Yeah.
clinical populations. And I
Yeah.
really think it's a reductionist view of
Yeah.
trying to look at the problem. So let's think about it from a perspective of what stimulates growth,
Mm.
mechanical tension. I think we'd all agree that we
Hmm.
have to have mechanical tension. The hormonal model of training has
Mm.
kind of gone by the wayside,
Break
the
you
acute
down. Yeah.
hormonal
Yeah.
fluctuations. Does it
Yeah.
play a role? I would absolutely say it does, but not the
Hmm.
role that we thought in the 80s and the 90s.
Hmm.
So mechanical tension is important. So we have to get stronger. So we can't stay in the same training indefinitely. We need variation.
Hmm.
So Paul Quinn actually in 1985, or yeah, I think it was 85, he basically wrote this theoretical paper about using, and this is where the nonlinear thing came from. And it's based on some stuff that Vladimir Zatsiorsky talked about, basically rotating training targets every 2 weeks. So you might do a block of 2 weeks of sets of hypertrophic repetition ranges and loadings. But then you might shift to 2 weeks of strength development where you're doing higher loads and lower volume, which aligns with some stuff that Andy Fry presented, where he suggested higher loads give you more mechanical tension if the volume is high enough to get more hypertrophy. So you could basically have a period where you're working on cross-sectional area, then a period where you're working on strength. And because you get stronger, then when you go back to hypertrophy training, you would get more mechanical tension because you're lifting a heavier load more times. And from a theoretical construct, it makes a lot of sense. Now, there are very few well-designed good studies in the hypertrophy space that have actually looked at those kind of constructs. And where it gets muddy in the hypertrophy space, if you look at a lot of Brad Schoenfeld's work, you can see that they kind of clump all kinds of measures of hypertrophy together. So you've got ultrasound, using muscle thickness, which is not a great measure because if the probe isn't done on there correctly, it can artificially make it smaller or larger. You've got MRI, you've got DEXA, you've got wide field of view ultrasound,
Yeah.
and even sometimes you've got circumference thrown in there.
Mm. Hmm.
And so all of these measures are often thrown into these studies that say that hypertrophy isn't affected by
Yeah.
periodization. So I know of no really good studies that look at
Hmm.
hypertrophy in a truly periodized way where nutrition is controlled
That's
and,
right. Yeah.
and done well
Hmm.
and used a robust measure of hypertrophy. And some of the projects you have to be really careful because there was some debate about dietary supplements about 10 years ago where people were carb depleting their subjects before they did their pre-measure and then carb loading them afterwards and creating a false narrative with ultrasound
Hmm.
or DEXA of hypertrophy. So I think that's a problem in this space. I think that space is really wrought
Okay.
with kind of some issues,
Yeah.
and the good studies are hard to find. So I think periodization has a place because you can't just do the same thing indefinitely. You've
Mm.
got to have periods of recovery. You have to have periods of intensification. And you have to
Mm.
have goals. Like if I'm training for a physique contest, I know where I need
Mm.
to get to. I know
Mm.
where I need to manipulate things.
Yeah.
And so fundamentally, I'm trying to train towards a target. And, to be honest, I think Professor Stone's former student, Dr. Mike Israetel, has made a lot of money
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about periodization of nutrition
Yeah.
and
Yeah. I see that.
hypertrophy. And so if you look at a lot what he does, it's I think even in one of his podcasts or online things, he actually pulled up the book that I wrote with Dr. Bompa and said,
Mm.
people need to read this.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think there's a space for it. I just think the research hasn't been done in a way to support it. And I think there's a lot of researchers that like to be controversial, so they create narratives to get, citations.
Yeah, interesting. So is it do we then say that periodization always matters? Is it if you take the holistic view, right,
Yeah.
for anyone who's training and who wants to improve in many, in any way, periodization always matters.
I go with the old adage, failure to plan is planning to fail.
Yeah, yeah,
So in a
that's a
way,
book.
periodization is a framework to try to enhance your goals of
Hmm.
achieving something.
Hmm.
Now that
Hmm.
that but I will go back to there's a multitude of programming structures in how to get somewhere.
Hmm.
An
That's
analogy
the
I
thing, yeah.
often use is let's say I live in Joondalup, let's say, in Western Australia, and I want to get to Margaret River. Well, my goal is to get to Margaret River. There's a multitude of ways to get there. I could
Yeah,
walk, I could ride a bike, I could get on a scooter, I could rent a helicopter. You
yeah.
know, I could use a multitude of ways, and some ways are really efficient, and some ways really
Uh-huh.
aren't.
Yeah.
And so that's how I look at periodization is I'm setting a framework of what I'm trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
And we're going to forecast where we're trying to get to. And we make modifications based on our monitoring program to dial in that training. And I don't think we
Hmm.
can separate the two. The problem that I'm seeing in modern sport is that we're becoming hyper reactive to our monitoring program and deviating from our plan too aggressively
Okay.
and forgetting that, we're not going to be optimal all the time. We're going to have times
Hmm.
when we're not optimal and we have to kind of get to where we want to be. And that's where projection comes in. It may be where AI becomes a big part of
Right.
periodization and guiding the projections of where we're trying to get to.
Yeah. Yeah, that brings me to my next question actually. So, it's easy enough to kind of plan someone's training macro cycle, whatever it may be, but plans are always subject to change. And yes, these days, like you said, there's so much new data available to coaches, and there's so many more decisions we can make based on so many more metrics and data points,
Yeah.
HRV, RP, GPS. How do we know what to put, most of our stock into, and how many of these metrics should be measuring? How do we really know when to change that plan or stick to our guns?
So here's the way I look at it. So I use the annual plan as my framework. It's a scaffold or a blueprint that sets my direction. And that's based on our competitive schedule. That's based on the direction we're trying to go. And I think every year we can easily establish that. Okay. And we set our performance goals for that year. I think that's pretty logical. And then what we do is we work on a mesocycle to mesocycle perspective or a two mesocycle to mesocycle perspective. I mean,
Hmm.
I always tell students, I'm like, I'm not going to ask you to write a training program for, you know, May 20th, 2026,
Hmm.
because we don't know where you're going to actually be then.
Hmm.
You could be ahead of schedule or behind schedule. So what we're looking at is benchmark goals. Like where are you on your criteria measures that are related to your sport? Like is your VO2 max in an endurance sport? Is it in the right direction? Is your body composition where we want it to be? Is your strength levels relative where we want it to be? What are your performance surrogates? Where are they? And then we program. Now, the programming, basically, we can fine tune it with periodic performance testing and monitoring. Now, we've got to put some bandwidth into it because we are seeing a lot of modern athletes are manipulating monitoring to get out of training. And they're
Hmm.
basically
Hmm.
creating a scenario because we're so worried about injury right now and
That's right.
wellness that they figure out real quick how to make training get
Okay.
easy.
Okay.
And so I think that's part of the problem of over technology in science. I think an interesting conversation I had with Professor Stone, Professor Hakkinen, Professor Schmidt-Bleicher, and Professor Kramer when I was in Finland a couple of years ago was that people are forgetting they got to train, and training doesn't always feel good. And so so we have to kind of think of it from that perspective. So the training process or the training interventions are infinitely modifiable and flexible
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
if I notice an athlete starting to get an imbalance, well, I can address it
Hmm.
and still be under my periodization framework.
Hmm.
So what I often tell my students, and they sometimes get a little frustrated. So let's say I want to build leg strength. We could argue that probably the single best exercise for building leg strength is the back squat. I think we would all agree that. If I'm working with a rugby player who happens to hurt their back, but I still need to develop strength in the legs, obviously I'm probably not going to be able to back squat. But I can do other things to develop leg strength. Is it the most optimal way? No. But is it the way that I have to go? Yes. And so, am I still in line with my periodized goals of developing lower body strength? Yep. I've
Hmm.
just had to modify the means and the modes and the methods
Hmm.
to address that. And so, we're still in the context of periodized model. We're just adjusting the strategy that we're using to accomplish it. And
Hmm.
that's the way I frame it when I think about the guiding of the training process. Now, what does the monitoring do? It informs my decisions as a coach. I think we've gotten into a very dangerous place where monitoring dictates to me as a coach what I can and cannot do.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because I can tell you that working in, for example, let's say the special operations place in the military, they can do things that you don't think people can do out of sheer will and be fine. And every metric would tell you that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think you have to realize the human can push itself or
Yeah. Okay.
themselves very hard if they truly want to. Our job is to make sure they don't push themselves to a point where they break.
Mm. Hmm.
So I tend to look at monitoring as a different context. I don't look at it as what I can't do. I look at it
Hmm.
what can I do.
Okay.
So how hard can I push them is what my monitoring will tell me.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's a different mindset, I know, but
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it is. I'm more worried about having too little training load and being
that's
too
right. Yeah.
unresilient.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. It's such a simple shift in perspective, but in reality, most people could probably be doing a little bit more or could tolerate a little bit more, providing they're eating well and sleeping well, etc. So I think that that mindset shift would help a lot of coaches, especially when it comes to trying to understand what monitoring is actually doing for them. And like you said, it's not really dictating the decisions, rather just informing the
Mhm.
decisions, right? In the research space, so you alluded to obviously the some of the hypertrophy research earlier having some, issues. If we think of research in periodization, just in general, from a broader perspective, what do you want to see in the future being done there, and what are the current gaps that you think, could be filled and should be filled?
I think it's really difficult to do periodization research because most
Mm,
of the
yeah.
research that's classified as periodization is really programming research
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's about long term. And so retrospective studies are probably our best approach, looking at successful athletes and looking at their years and years of training logs. It is very difficult to do really good periodization literature research because everything commingles.
Mm,
If my nutrition's not right, my periodization of my physical training could be perfect and not work. And so I think one of the things we have to do is start to look more holistically at the construct. I think Inigo Mujika and Shauna Halson and um, Louise Burke in their review paper did a really nice job of talking about the holistic nature of periodization and how you had to think about the periodization of recovery, you had to think about the periodization of nutrition. And I think a lot of people don't understand that it's got to be more inclusive. I mean, we've did some work with Shauna and Halson and also Dale Chapman and Eric Drinkwater with a doctoral student that we supervised, Barry Horgan, and we looked at these constructs of different, recovery methodologies to try to understand, if we want to be conservative, we could say, all right, we're not going to do any cold water immersion in the prep phase. But when we looked at elite athletes, they still had benefit. A lot of the research that's showing cold water immersion bad is not in athletes who are training at the real high end of training. So I think you have to kind of look at the idea of doing work that has meaning and also being careful not to how did Dr. Stone put it in a recent way? We were talking about this. Don't let the research overrule common sense. Because we have a lot of data for decades about organizing training works. And just because some new statistical measure on some new device
mm,
says we should just abandon it, let's step back and let's replicate
yeah.
replicate a little bit of research to see if that actually is true.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I guess that's one of the things that some people might struggle to understand, especially the ones who aren't very privy to research. It's like it is hard to conduct research in periodization because of the long time scales and the interaction between so many variables. And yeah, I like the point that you brought up about not letting the data overrule or override common sense because that's also so common these days where people struggle to kind of make appropriate interpretations from the research and actually turn them into practical recommendations.
Yeah, that's a big problem, especially since AI
Mm.
misinterprets a lot of research.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
And if you
Yeah.
can actually, one of my master's students, we're doing some work in the velocity space, and he was like, these researchers are saying that this paper says X, and he goes to the
Hmm.
paper and it says it doesn't even say this.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well.
And so you have this problem where in the social media space, people promote research interpretations,
Hmm.
and then people don't actually go check that
Hmm.
that interpretation is
Yeah. Is
correct.
correct. Yeah.
So, for example, I'll use a classic. So, in his 1994 paper, Dan Baker wrote, he mentioned this idea of periodization. He looked at comparing what he called nonlinear and linear periodization.
Okay.
And he quoted that Professor Stone was the founder of linear periodization.
Hmm.
1995, Stone and O'Brien wrote a letter to the editor and basically schooled them on the fact that they were wrong and misquoting everything. I mean, it was
Wow.
the letter to the editor was like your eyes just wanted to pop out
Brutal.
because it was brutal.
Mm.
And I'm good friends with Dan Baker. He's a great guy, a great researcher. It was just a terminology problem.
Right.
But the reality was that that is how things spiral. And so that is the start point of the nonlinear terminology in that
Okay.
1994 paper. And then it became, Bill Kramer, Ray, and them, they propagated it. And now you have many terms. And the velocity space is the same way. For example, everybody says that the maximum strength is so highly variable from day to day, which is bunk. Andy Fry showed in the 90s that even in an overtrained state, you can maintain strength.
Mm.
Unless you were so overtrained that you were really debilitated. But people quote it, and we traced it all the way back to the original paper, and it was a throwaway line with no evidence, but it grows.
Mhm.
So this
Mhm.
is one of my big things at the moment is we need to read backwards.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, we have a nice paper that just got accepted, myself and Salome Bartolome from Italy. We worked on translating Kotoff's seminal text from 1916 Olympic sport to English.
Wow.
And we wrote some of the ancient, yes, 1916, not ancient, but historical constructs related to training theory. And a lot of things are the same again. I know I've said
Yeah,
that a
yeah.
couple times.
Yeah,
But
wow.
again, it's because people don't go back far enough. And I think I
Uh-huh.
blame universities for that. Because I know at some universities I've been at, they have like a 10-year thing that they only let students look back 10 years or 20
Mm.
years.
Hmm. Yeah, or reference. Sometimes you can only reference a paper within the last 10 years.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
is really bad. I know I've
Hmm.
actually at my university gotten into arguments with learning
Interesting.
people saying, well, then we can't reference gravity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So gravity no longer exists and the
Uh,
planet is no longer round.
it's outside that 10-year
And
zone, yeah.
yeah, and they just sit there and with these like look, and I'm like, no, no, we got to train our doctoral students and our master's
I
students
like
to
that.
go
Yeah.
back all the way to the beginning
Yeah.
and understand the progression of theories and constructs. And it's a lot more work, but to be honest, they'll be far better professionals.
Yeah, wow. So, yeah, it seems that periodization has obviously held its ground over such a long time scale, but you alluded to kind of the implementation of AI
Yep.
earlier. And so that's obviously one of the biggest kind of, technological changes that we've seen recently. How is that going to impact the future of periodization? And what do you think that future actually looks like?
So I think, well, let's be honest, AI is out of the bag. It's going to be around. It's not going to go away.
Hmm. Hmm.
We've got to figure out how to ethically use it in a way that isn't detrimental to sporting culture and society.
Mm, okay.
And I think the issue that we can look at is where will AI have its place? Well, I think the first thing is forecasting performance over time. If we have enough data points, we can forecast things. And I'll use a sport like track cycling. Track cycling is wonderful for forecasting because you have a power meter, you have heart rate variables, you have wind resistance variables, you have body composition variables, VO2 max variables, and then you can also use nutritional variables and all
Mm,
those things. And you could create a mathematical model to predict performance. And so you could figure out, all right, if I change the circumference of the quadricep, how is that going to translate to speed on the bike?
right.
And you could use the AI to kind of fine tune the direction of the training process. I suggest it would probably be beneficial for monitoring large swaths of
Mm,
data.
hmm.
And I think that's probably where it'll have the most impact. But I think people will try to use it to monitor for injury risk instead of
Okay.
performance gain. And those are two very different paradigms because injury risk is usually restrictive, performance gain is usually progressive. Um, and also looking at time courses of development. For example, if I'm training an Olympic athlete, I'm really training a young athlete right now for 8 years from now. And what is my long-term progression in my trajectory? And how do I alter that trajectory? One of the best talks I've ever seen was by Dr. Martin back in 2004 before the Athens Games. He was talking about Anna Mears and her progression towards her Olympic performance. And he was noting that she was progressing too quickly. in the annual training plan. So they had to change the loading in order to make her progress rate slow down, in order to make sure she optimized at the games, not before the games.
Yeah, wow.
And so I would suggest that's where AI may be becoming beneficial, is to take all these variables and see how they interrelate with one another to kind of project where we might go. And I think that's probably where, what I call it is precision performance.
Mm,
We're trying to make a more almost like precision health or precision medicine, where we use a digital twin type model to kind of create a model of our athlete and then figure out where we're going and what those changes are. Now, we need a lot of data and we need a lot of
mm,
time. And the
mm.
problem with these models is we don't often have enough data, because the big monkey wrench in the whole thing is genetics. So how do you
Okay.
work genetics into the model? Because some people respond very differently to training
Mm,
than other people. I don't respond personally to aerobic training very well, but I respond really well to strength training.
mm, mm,
So we all have different genetic attributes. So I think that's going to be some of the stuff that people will want to get into. I don't know where it will go.
mm, mm,
I do think people are becoming more interested in not having periodized models and just programming week to week. But the problem with that is you never know where you're going. So how do
mm,
you know if you got there?
mm, mm. Yeah. It sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Maybe your next book will be how will AI help inform our periodization?
Oh, I
Yeah.
touch on big data in my book,
Yeah.
actually.
Cool. Cool.
I talk a little bit about it, and the fact that we are the problem with big data in modern sport is, are the devices that we are putting so much weight into actually giving us what we want?
That's a big
So,
one. Yeah.
so when we look at
Yeah.
wearables, for example,
Yeah.
everybody's on the heart rate variability
Yeah.
bandwagon at the moment.
Yeah.
But the
All that.
problem is wearables are not very good at heart rate variability. Most of the good heart rate variability stuff is with EKG.
Yeah.
And so is the data really accurate? I know Whoop now has the ability supposedly to measure blood pressure on a wearable.
Yeah.
And, as much as I like tech, I wasn't willing to spend the money to get,
Yeah.
it was an extra two, $300 to maybe have blood pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But are these devices actually accurate? And I think that's the problem that we run into, is we're making decisions on devices that may have a lot of noise in the system. For example, velocity meters. IMUs and accelerometers tend to be really noisy. And sometimes when we say, oh, if you go up X zero point zero 0.02 meters per second, you've gained X amount of strength. But a lot of times that's
Mm,
within the noise range of those devices.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So how do
So
you
are we
know?
actually measuring noise, or are we
Hmm.
actually measuring signal
Change. Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah.
true change,
Yeah.
And so I think that's where this can all get a little bit murky, because if the AI is making decisions off of noise, is that,
Yeah.
because remember, AI is just predictive algorithms.
That's right.
And so if it doesn't have good data,
Yeah,
can you?
it's similar to what you said before with the meta-analysis. It's like garbage going in, garbage coming out.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
you can make a meta-analysis do whatever you want, I think,
yeah,
if
yeah.
you just restrict the variables enough. And I think
Mm,
people do it.
mm,
I think as a good scientist, you have to come in with the idea of you're trying to find the truth and
mm,
let the truth be what the truth is.
mm, mm.
Every study we do, we always make sure that we have a hypothesis, but if we reject that
Yeah,
hypothesis, then we would still publish it. We don't
yeah,
say, oh,
yeah.
no, we're not going to publish it because we didn't
Interesting.
prove that
Yeah,
X worked.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, even if you look at some of the mid-thigh pull stuff that I've done, you can see like 10 papers that, five say X and five say Y,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
And so, but then you start to look at, okay, why? Why is there a
yeah.
difference? Oh,
Yeah.
population is different.
It's obviously
Um,
subsequent questions to ask. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, for sure. So Greg, where can people find this book? Where's the best place to find this book? And where's the best place for them to find out more about you?
So I think, well, the book is available at Amazon. Human Kinetics also has it. I hate to say Booktopia because I know they went into administration
Yeah,
last
yeah,
year,
they're
but
back. They're
they
back, I
seem to
think.
be back. But I know
Yeah.
Amazon has it and HK has it as well. Um, so the book's been out for about a year, so it's there. I am always at the National Strength and Conditioning Association in the U.S. If you're there, I've been attending there since 1995, and I very, very, very rarely miss. In fact, the only two that I didn't attend in person were during the COVID lockdown.
Yeah, and
We
that's in
weren't allowed to.
Kansas. Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's in Kansas.
This is this year.
It's in Kansas City, which is exciting because it's near the Woosai Sports Research Center at the University of Kansas.
Cool.
I did my PhD at the University of Kansas, so it's like going home.
All right.
The last time it was in Kansas was 1999 when I graduated from my PhD. So it's like
Cool.
26,
Long time ago.
27
Yeah.
years ago that I
Yeah.
was there
Wow.
for a conference. So I'll definitely be there. This year I'll be at the International Conference of Strength Training in Germany, Freiburg.
Nice.
I'm very honored to be doing a pre-conference symposium with my wife, who I don't often do talks with, and the two of us are working together on an applied kind of session, which would be a lot of fun. So we're actually going to do some physical things. And then, I'm at Edith Cowan University. I'm not the
Hmm.
head of the strength and conditioning program anymore, but that doesn't mean I'm not there.
Yeah.
I'm actually probably one of the main instructors. I just am in the background a little bit more. Um, for now, I don't know if that'll stay that way, but eventually something will have to change, I guess. And I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. So
Awesome. What's Blue
on
Sky?
Twitter, but I'll be
That's
honest, I don't
that's
go
new.
on Twitter very often anymore. Um, it's just too political for me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A Blue Sky. I've never heard of Blue Sky. I just
It's the competitor to
yeah.
Twitter.
I see
It
that. It
was
looks very similar.
so it's more like the old Twitter when before it was
Okay.
sold to Elon Musk. So the
Yes.
founder of Twitter created Blue Sky.
Yeah, there you go.
It's
Yeah.
a little bit different. I'm not there as much as I'd like to be. I'm kind of getting
Yeah.
away from the social media space because I actually
Okay.
think, I mean, I still do it occasionally, but I think a lot of young strength and conditioning coaches are getting far too much garbage from social
Oh,
media,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
they're and also I think that's the problem with the AIs as well because they scrape the internet and they get the
Hmm.
garbage.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it is a problem, and yeah, like social media, it was never designed to be an education platform, but it seems like it kind of is becoming one for a lot of these beginner coaches and for people in general.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah. As a whole, I mean, well, it's definitely there's a wonderful book called Like War, how social media is used for warfare and how disinformation spreads. Um,
Mm.
and I think our profession of sports science, strength and conditioning is probably really at risk of disinformation.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot going on. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Greg. Thanks for the
Yeah, you're
chat.
welcome.
Really enjoyed it.
Cheers.